The wind howls fiercely as a wooden ship battles towering waves under a sky painted with streaks of lightning. Salt spray stings the sailors' faces, their hands gripping trembling ropes, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and fierce determination. These explorers faced the endless, unforgiving ocean with nothing but simple tools, courage, and an unshakable hope of discovery. Their navigation instruments, clunky, mysterious, seemed like magic, guiding them through storms and darkness, as if by spells. Behind these devices lay human ingenuity and desperation, pushing the limits of endurance. Every voyage was a gamble with nature, with lives hanging in. The balance on creaking decks and in cramped, damp cabins. These stories are about more than mapping coastlines. They're about the spirit of daring humans confronting the vast unknown. If you're fascinated by the bravery and innovation of these maritime pioneers, hit subscribe to reach 3,000 followers, share where you're watching from, and drop a wave emoji to show you're connected. You ever wonder what it felt like to stand on a wooden deck, freezing cold, salt spray stinging your face, wind howling in your ears, with the vast ocean stretching endlessly around you? Imagine the dampness soaking into your bones, the creaking of the old ship, groaning under the strain of relentless waves. That's the real face of those ancient voyages, the kind of experience that sticks with you long after the ship's docked or sank. Today, we're diving deep into this world, an era when explorers sailed into the unknown, armed with little more than planks of wood, simple tools, and a daring spirit. The Age of Discovery, roughly from the late 1400s through the 1700s, was a time when nations like Portugal and Spain pushed out into the Atlantic, searching for new routes, new lands, and new riches. But behind every map, marked with new coastlines and treasure ports, were stories of human endurance, innovation, and sometimes sheer desperation. Let's start with the ships themselves. These weren't the sleek vessels of modern times. They were massive, rugged, and built from about 2,000 trees each, mostly oak and pine. The wood had to be strong, yet flexible enough to bend with the ocean's fury. Craftsmen used basic tools, adzes, saws, and chisels, crafted by hand. They layered planks with tar and pitch to keep water out. Some ships, like the carrack, had a high, rounded stern and a bulky hull, perfect for long journeys but tough to maneuver. The galleons, sleeker and faster, became the workhorses of empire. Life on board, it was brutal. Hierarchy ruled fiercely. The captain sat high in the stern, wielding authority like a king. The ship's master or navigator was a mix of scientist and sailor, skilled in reading the stars and steering through storms. Below deck, sailors and soldiers occupied cramped, damp quarters. The air was thick with salt, mold, and the smell of wet rope. Conditions were extreme, cold, wet, and sometimes deadly. Imagine being battered by storms, seas pounding you for days on end. The crew faced malnutrition, scurvy, and illnesses like dysentery. Food? Mostly hardtack, dried meat, and salted fish, some of it rotten or infested. Fresh water was scarce and often contaminated. Navigation was a mix of rudimentary tools, but revolutionary thinking. They used the sun, stars, and the moon, relying on instruments that look primitive today, but were cutting edge then. The astrolabe, for instance, helped determine latitude by measuring the angle of the stars. The compass pointed true north, a device imported from China, but often unreliable in storms or near the magnetic poles. They also used dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, direction, and time. It was imprecise, and many ships lost their way or ended up wrecked on unseen reefs. Now, here's the kicker. Many of these navigation instruments sounded like magic or witchcraft. Imagine holding a tiny brass device that could tell you exactly where you were, even in the middle of a pitch-black night. That's what those sailors relied on, tools that seemed almost supernatural to untrained eyes. They believed some of these instruments had mystical properties, and sailors often prayed to saints for guidance. The journeys could last months. The average transatlantic voyage from Europe to the Americas took about 6 weeks. Storms, scurvy, hunger, and death haunted every trip. Mortality rates were high, around 20% on some voyages. For many sailors, it was a battle just to survive each day. The mental toll, enormous. The constant rocking, the endless horizon, the loneliness, the fear of sinking or mutiny, all wore down even the strongest men. And when disaster struck, shipwrecks, storms, or disease could wipe out entire crews. One storm or rogue wave could crush a ship in seconds. The helplessness was overwhelming. That cold salt water became a prison, a killer. Still they pressed on. The human spirit, the drive to explore and conquer, fueled their persistence. So, to sum it up, those voyages were not just about maps and treasures. They were about people, mariners enduring freezing cold, scorching sun, hunger, sickness, and fear, all while trusting in strange, almost magical tools that changed navigation forever. It's a story of human resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless push into the unknown, with the ocean as both adversary and highway. If you like stories about daring adventures and human grit, buckle up, because these voyages were the ultimate test of human endurance, with every sailor fighting to survive in a world that seemed almost hostile, yet full of promise. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a ship, the sun blazing down, the air thick with salt and rotting wood. The wind cuts sharply across your face, cold as a blade, seeping into your bones. Your hands are sore, blistered from clutching the rigging, and every breath tastes of brine and damp canvas. Now picture that feeling. Imagine the claustrophobic chaos, multiplying by hundreds of days at sea. This is the reality of the sailors during the age of exploration. Today, we're going to uncover some of the strangest, almost magical tools they used. 8 navigation. Instruments that seemed straight out of witchcraft. If you're into history, especially maritime adventures, hit that like button now. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's set the scene. It's the 15th to 18th centuries. The world's oceans are a vast, uncharted nightmare. Ships are floating prisons, small, fragile, often built from not more than 2,000 trees, cramped with sailors fighting the cold, the hunger, and the fear of the unknown. In an era when maps looked more like doodles, sailors relied on instruments that seem almost magical, like they were conjured by sorcerers rather than sailors. These tools weren't just gadgets, they were lifelines, salvation in a sea of darkness. But here's the catch. These instruments often appeared mysterious, almost spooky. Some looked like they belonged in a witch's cabinet, not on a ship. They seemed to have powers beyond understanding, and honestly, cruel but real. The sailors' survival depended on trusting these devices, even when the sky was clouded, the stars hidden, and the sea was furious. Today, we're diving into 8 of those strange instruments, the ones that made sailors look like they had magic at their fingertips. But before we get into the technical details, let's understand the human side. Imagine being a sailor, your skin cracked and peeling from hours in the salty wind, your gums bleeding from scurvy, your teeth falling out, and every day feeling like a gamble with death. You'd be sick, exhausted, terrified, and yet there was no choice but to keep going. Now, about navigation. It's not just about knowing where you are. Back then they had no GPS, no satellites. The stars were their guides, the compass their hope. But even that wasn't foolproof. Sometimes clouds would hide the stars, or the compass needle would spin wildly if it got wet or was near metal. So sailors turned to their strange, almost mystical instruments. Some looked like jewelry, others like pieces of scrap metal, but all promised to reveal the secrets of the sea. Let's start with the first one, the mariner's astrolabe. It looks like a tiny mechanical clock, crafted from brass, with a rotating arm and a ring etched with degrees. It was created in the 15th century, and sailors used it to measure the altitude of the sun or stars. Picture yourself on deck, the sun blazing, trying to hold a small, fragile instrument steady in your trembling hands. You'd angle it towards the sky, hoping not to drop it into the salty abyss. The process was tricky. Imagine your sweating palms, the stinging wind, the constant rocking of the ship. Once you get the right angle, you read the degrees. Simple? Think again. Temperature, humidity, salt, and shaking hands could throw it all off. And even then, it was dangerous. Drop it, and the whole calculation was ruined. But it was a leap forward. No more guessing, just numbers. Numbers that told you if you were getting closer to land or drifting aimlessly. Next up, the chantika crossstaff. It looks like a simple wooden stick with a sliding crossbar. Sailors held it up to their eye and aligned it with the sun or a star, then read the angle from a scale. Easy? Not quite. It required close proximity to the eye, and if the sun was obscured or the sky cloudy, it was useless. It's like trying to read a secret message in a fog. Still, it was a vital tool, especially before the astrolabe became more widespread. But not all instruments looked so scientific. The Yest backstaff, another eerie-looking device, allowed sailors to measure the altitude of the sun without facing it directly. Imagine holding a long blade-shaped device against the horizon, watching the shadow it cast. The sailor would read the shadow's length and determine their latitude. It sounds simple, but in reality, it was a dangerous dance with the sun, often risking eye damage or misreading the shadow. Yet it was a game-changer, more accurate, safer for the eyes and less affected by weather. But the real magic started with the quadrant. Think of a quarter circle, made from wood or brass, with a plumb line hanging from the center. Sailors used it to find the altitude of celestial objects, especially if the astrolabe or cross staff failed. It was often inscribed with degree markings and had a sighting mechanism. Once the sailor lined it up with a star or the sun, they'd read the angle. Very precise for the time. The key was accuracy. 1 degree off could mean missing your destination by hundreds of miles. And then the nocturnal. This one looks almost like an elaborate pocket watch, with a star chart etched inside. How does it work? At night, you turn the dial to match the current time, align it with specific stars marked inside, and it would tell you your latitude. It was like having a tiny secret star map in your pocket. Imagine the quiet of the night, stars twinkling above, the ship creaking, and you desperately trying to keep the instrument steady against the rocking deck. If it worked, it could mean the difference between reaching land or drifting forever. Now, what about the magnetic compass? It seems simple, a needle on a pivot pointing north. But it was more than that. Early compasses were often made from lodestone, magnetized iron ore. Sailors believed the needle was guided by mystical forces, and to be honest, they might have been right. The compass was a spiritual instrument, almost like a talisman. Yet it had its flaws: magnetic declination, interference from metal or ship's iron fittings, and the ever-present risk of losing the needle altogether. And finally, the sand glass. Not mystical, but essential. It's not an instrument for navigation, but for measuring time. Imagine trying to keep track of the hours, knowing that your ship's life depended on it. The tiny grains of sand falling, steadily marking the seconds, minutes, hours. It was crucial for maintaining longitude, or at least for estimating how long you'd been sailing. All these devices had one thing in common. They seemed like some form of magic. They weren't easy to master, and often they were as much a gamble as a science. Their creators were often secretive, almost like witches guarding their spells. The sailors, they relied on luck, skill, and a trust in these strange objects that looked more like talismans than tools. And here's the kicker. Despite all their seeming magic, the mortality rate was staggering. Up to 20% of crews didn't make it home. Malnutrition, scurvy, storms, shipwrecks, and disease took their toll. Imagine losing friends, watching crew members die from fever or hunger, their bodies tossed overboard into the endless sea. The mental toll? Unimaginable. The loneliness, the fear, the ever-present threat of mutiny or disaster. But they kept sailing, driven by curiosity, greed, empire, or hope. So, imagine yourself back then, clutching one of these instruments, staring at a star, feeling the ship sway beneath your feet. You're part of something huge, an adventure that changed the world. And all of this, with just a handful of strange tools and a lot of guts. If you want to know exactly how, sailors turned these pieces of brass and wood into navigational miracles. You know what? There's a whole video on that. But for now, just try to picture it. A fragile human trying to tame the mighty ocean with what looks like witchcraft. An epic struggle. A testament to human ingenuity in the face of brutality. And honestly, it's a story you won't forget. Imagine yourself on a ship, hundreds of miles from land, cradled by the endless, unforgiving ocean. The wind howls through the rigging, salt stings your skin, and the wooden planks beneath your feet creak with every roll. You're part of a crew risking everything. Dreams of riches, empire, or simply survival. And as you look out over the vast blue, you realize how fragile your existence really is. Here's a secret. Navigating these waters wasn't just about maps or stars. It was about facing raw, brutal problems, each one worse than the last. Today, let's dive into some of the harsh realities sailors faced and how they fought, back using tools and tricks that seem almost magical, or even witchcraft. First, let's talk about the biggest threat, storms. They could rise up suddenly, black clouds swallowing the sky, lightning slicing through the darkness. Cruel, but real. The sailors relied heavily on their knowledge of weather signs and their ship's sturdiness. But when the storm hit, the real problem was keeping the ship afloat. The decks flooded fast, water pouring in through cracks or broken planks. To survive, sailors would jury-rig patches using scrap wood and tar, sealing gaps with pitch, hot, sticky, biting black stuff that cooled into a waterproof barrier. They knew that a single breach could sink the entire ship. Imagine the frantic work, shoveling water out with buckets, trying to keep the ship from becoming a sinking coffin. And if the storm didn't do it, the sea itself had other plans. The cold was an invisible killer. The wind may have been loud, but the icy water was deadly. Quiet, waiting. The temperature could plummet to near freezing, especially in Atlantic storms. Sailors suffered frostbite, fingers blackening, toes numb, limbs trembling uncontrollably. They wrapped themselves in layered wool, soaked in tar or oil to repel the cold, knowing that hypothermia could set in within minutes. But not everyone was lucky. Sometimes they'd lose consciousness, slip beneath the icy waves, never to rise again. The cold was an assassin, silent but swift. Then there was the problem of hunger and disease. Malnutrition was a slow killer. Salted meat and hardtack, dry, stale bread were all they had. Moldy, infested with larvae, sometimes crawling with bugs. They'd often have to chew through it, gums bleeding, teeth falling out just to keep going. And scurvy? That horrible disease caused by vitamin C deficiency? It turned flesh into raw meat. Gums bleeding, teeth falling out, muscles weakening. Sailors kept citrus on hand when possible, but supplies ran out fast. Some turned yellow, their skin jaundiced, eyes sunken. It was a slow, painful death, but not everything could be fixed by supplies. The real challenge was navigation. Imagine you're trying to find your way across a featureless ocean. The stars are your guide, but clouds hide them. The compass sometimes fails or drifts off due to magnetic anomalies. That's where the sailors' ingenuity shined. They used a device called the mariner's compass, a magnetic needle floating in a liquid-filled box, allowing them to keep a rough sense of direction even in fog or darkness. Still, compasses could be unreliable, sometimes disoriented by local magnetic fields or faulty craftsmanship. You'd need to constantly cross-check with the sun or stars, which could be obscured by storm clouds. A wrong turn could mean drifting off course for days, risking starvation or running aground. Now, here's where things get really tricky. Imagine being seasick, vomiting over the side while the ship pitches wildly. Your stomach's twisted in knots. The salty air burns your nostrils and every wave crashes with a deafening boom. Add to that the mental toll, loneliness, fear, the constant threat of mutiny or worse. Many sailors suffered from what they called ship fever, a mix of scurvy, dysentery and depression. They'd resort to desperate measures, drinking seawater which only worsened dehydration, or biting on leather to keep their jaws from trembling. Sometimes they'd get infected cuts or sores, which quickly worsened, turning gangrenous. And when someone was too sick to work, they'd be left behind, tossed overboard, forgotten. It was a brutal, dehumanizing reality. But humans are resourceful. Let's look at some of their solutions. When a sailor got sick, they used herbal infusions, fresh herbs like yarrow or ginger, partly to stave off infections. For wounds, they'd pack them with crushed garlic or moldy bread, harnessing the natural antiseptics. They knew that in this floating prison, improvisation was everything. When water ran low, sailors would melt ice from the ship's bilge. Dirty, yes, but sometimes their only source of fresh water. They'd also collect rainwater in barrels, a precious commodity on long voyages. Sometimes they'd even make salt from seawater by boiling it over open fires, evaporating the water and leaving behind the salt, crystal by crystal, a salty treasure that extended their survival. Now, consider the ship itself. Wooden, heavy, built to withstand the pounding. But even the sturdiest vessel was vulnerable. Rot, worm infestation, and structural fatigue threatened everyone's lives. Up to 20% of crews didn't make it home, victims of shipwrecks or disease. The sailors knew the importance of maintenance, constantly repairing the hull, replacing rotted planks, patching the sails. They used materials like oakum, tar-soaked hemp fibers, to caulk seams, ceiling leaks. Sometimes they'd reinforce the hull with iron nails or braces, things they could craft on deck when needed. Yet the worst enemy was time itself. The longer they stayed at sea, the more likely it was that the ship would weaken or sink. What about the human side of all this? Picture sailors, young and old, pressed into service, often with no choice. Some signed on for adventure, others for bread and salt. They endured unimaginable hardship, days without sleep, constant threats, loneliness gnawing at their minds. Crew members often suffered from scurvy, dysentery, or just exhaustion. Some would break down mentally, cries in the night, despairing thoughts. Yet they kept going, driven by hope of land, treasure, a better life ashore. Their resilience was staggering. They faced storms, hunger, sickness, and death, all while trying to tame an unpredictable beast, the sea. Today, we have GPS, satellite weather, and modern medicine. Back then, they had charts drawn in ink, a handful of herbs, and a prayer. Even with all their flaws, these sailors created solutions, improvising, repairing, adapting. It was a fight for every inch of progress, every survival, and through that struggle, they pushed the boundaries of human endurance. If you want to know exactly how they turned simple tools into navigational miracles, there's a whole video on that. But for now, just imagine the scene. A human tiny against the vast, merciless ocean, battling storms, cold, hunger, and despair, yet driven by an unbreakable spirit. That's the real story of these colonial sailors, an epic saga of ingenuity and survival written in wood, salt, and sweat. And trust me, it's a story you won't forget. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a wooden ship. Hundreds of years ago, the horizon stretches endlessly, a churning curtain of grey and blue. The air is thick with salt, and the wind cuts like glass. You're one of hundreds, pressed into service by a world that doesn't care about your fears or your fatigue. You're a sailor, caught in a relentless battle between man and the merciless sea. And today I want to tell you about one of the strangest, most mysterious tools of the age of exploration, the so-called witchcraft navigation instruments. But beware, these weren't magic. They were human ingenuity in its rawest form, forged by desperate need, tested by the most brutal conditions nature could throw at them. Let's start with the background. In those days, sailors didn't have GPS or satellites, no digital maps, no real-time weather updates. They relied on tools that, to the modern eye, look like relics from a fairy tale. Compasses made of lodestone, the astrolabes, brass gears, and strange devices called cross-staffs or backstaffs. These instruments seemed almost magical because they let sailors do something unthinkable at the time: find their position on an open ocean where land was weeks away. One of the most captivating yet confounding of these devices was the poem mariner's astrolabe. Imagine a brass disc engraved with scales that you could hold up to the sun or the starry sky. It looked like something out of a witch's spellbook, but it wasn't magic. It was science, born from necessity. Sailors would measure the angle between the horizon and a celestial body, most often the sun at noon or Polaris at night. By doing so, they could determine their latitude. Simple idea, complicated execution. Now picture this: a sailor, sweaty and exhausted, trying to balance this heavy brass instrument on a shaky deck, the wind whipping his hair, salt stinging his eyes. When the sun was high, he'd need to hold the astrolabe steady, line it up with the star or the sun's shadow, and squint through a tiny hole or sighting device. The process was delicate. Any tremor, any gust of wind could throw off the measurement. And if the weather was cloudy or foggy, forget it. You could feel the frustration, your hopes pinned on a tiny needlepoint of light now, obscured by clouds. But don't think these sailors were just fumbling blindly. Their resilience is staggering. They'd often carry multiple instruments. Sometimes they even improvised with broken parts, using mirror shards or scraps of cloth to improve their sighting. They would record their readings in battered logbooks, the ink smudged with sweat or sea spray. These logs became sacred texts, repositories of hope and survival. Then came the cross staff, a device that looked even more like a witch's tool, two rods attached at right angles, with markings to measure angles of celestial bodies. It was simpler than the astrolabe, but less precise. Nonetheless, it was a vital backup, especially during long, dark nights or when the astrolabe was impossible to use. Here's where we get to the human story. A sailor, blindfolded by fatigue, might have to rely on his memory, his estimation, or just sheer instinct. Sometimes sailors would simply stare at the sky, knowing that the position of the stars told stories. Stories that had to be read and interpreted with intuition, not just instruments. But the real secret weapon of these sailors was their knowledge of celestial navigation. No instrument alone could save you. You needed a mental map, an understanding of the night sky, the movement of celestial bodies, and how to interpret their positions. Skilled sailors would memorize the stars' patterns, the phases of the moon, and the changing angles of the sun at different times of the year. They learned to trust their senses, what they saw, what they felt. Yet even with all these tools, danger lurked everywhere. Imagine a sailor with a sunburned face trembling from hunger and cold. His hands, once steady, now shook with fatigue or sickness. He's trying to get a reading, but the ship hits a rogue wave and the instrument slips, crashing into splinters. The sailor's heart sinks. Every mistake could mean lost land, a shipwreck, or starvation. They faced storms that could rip the masts apart, illness that could wipe out crews in days, and despair that could crack even the strongest minds. The psychological toll was immense. Many sailors broke down. Some would go mad, crying out in the night, haunted by the endless dark. And it wasn't just the physical challenges. Their minds were sharpened by constant pressure. They had to learn to interpret the faintest flicker of a star or the subtle shift of a shadow. It was a mental symphony. One misstep could cost everything. Can you imagine the weight of that responsibility? The quiet panic when a celestial event didn't match predictions. The hope that kept them going when everything else was falling apart. What's truly astonishing is how these sailors, often young men barely out of childhood, faced these horrors and survived. Their stories are full of sacrifice. Some sailors would lose their eyesight, their hands trembled forever, or their backs broke under the strain. But they kept pushing, driven by a mixture of hope and stubbornness, by the dreams of land, wealth, or simply the chance to be part of something bigger. Now, fast forward to today. We have GPS, satellites, real-time weather data. We navigate with the press of a button, protected by technology these sailors could only dream of. It's easy to forget how dangerous, how uncertain their journey was. These sailors stared into the abyss, trusting tools that looked like witchcraft, but were rooted in human science and perseverance. And think about the legacy they left. These early navigators, sometimes called the wizards of the sea, created a foundation for all modern exploration. They turned instruments that looked like arcane relics into reliable tools. They transformed fear and chaos into courage and discovery. Their resilience wasn't just about finding new lands. It was about pushing the limits of human endurance, faith, and ingenuity. So next time you look at a modern map or GPS, remember the sailors who navigated by the stars, by the sun, by their wits. They faced storms, starvation, sickness, and despair, sometimes all at once. They endured, they adapted, and through their sacrifices, they changed the world forever. If you want to know exactly how these witchcraft instruments worked in detail or hear more stories from the ships that crossed the vast oceans, there's a whole world of history waiting. But for now, just think about those tiny sailors, tiny against the universe, whose courage and resourcefulness made history. Their stories aren't just about navigation, they're about the unbreakable human spirit facing the unknown with nothing but hope, sweat, and a touch of what looked like magic. And honestly, that's the real magic.